All right, what is going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Thursday, February 24th of 2022. NBA is back tonight. I am stoked about it. Been missing it dearly, especially after completely donating to the NHL gods last night. So really looking forward to it. 7-game slate on tap for basketball tonight. Some awesome looking contests. Also the return of the free bet of the day and the prop bets as well, as if you're in the prop betting plan. So looking forward to it here. Yesterday, we had Matt on talking a little bit about our new NASCAR sims that are up now in the app. Highly recommend going and watching that video if you haven't seen it already. We're super excited about these simulations. They will give you a massive edge in your NASCAR contests because everybody else out there that's going to be building based on average projections and trying to build all the rules and groups that you need to build a lineup construction in NASCAR that actually makes sense is... First of all, that's very hard to do. Second of all, it takes a ton of time. If you build lineups in SaberSim with the NASCAR tools, it's going to build you the right kind of constructions right off the bat that allows you to spend your time managing risk or focusing on strategy or whatever you want to do there. So before the end of the week, I will be putting out a video onto our YouTube channel that combines kind of a lot of what I've learned from that talk with Matt, but also my conversation with Dan, aka Kingfish NATO, last week about overall NASCAR strategy into kind of a bite-sized 15-minute or so video about just how to beat NASCAR DFS with SaberSim. So look forward to that. We've obviously got another Cup race coming up here this weekend along with trucks and Xfinity. So 3 different races that you could play, build lineups for. So I will certainly be entering into all of those just because I'm super excited about the new NASCAR model. But we'll go ahead. Let's start getting into it here today. Only a couple questions in the queue for now, so we'll tackle these 2 questions. I know there were a couple folks that had asked questions yesterday, right before the NASCAR stream about other sports, so I wasn't able to get to those yesterday. So if we have some time, if we need to get some other questions in, we'll go ahead and jump over there. But as always, if you've got questions for me here, go ahead, pop them into the Office Hours channel in Slack, pop them into the YouTube chat, and let's get it going here. I'm going to start a good question here from GEN. And we'll start there with a question about the test build. So he said, how early should you run your test build prior to the start of the contest time? 30 minutes prior, or would an hour before be too early? Kind of depends. I mean, so first of all, like I'll run test builds just to see how things look throughout the day. Kind of whenever I feel like it, especially, if big news breaks and I just kind of want to see how lineups are looking throughout the day. I mean, you can run a test build just to get started, just to start thinking about the slate whenever. In terms of like that final, test build or my like research builds, like something I'm actually going to use that's going to have a meaningful impact on the way I approach the slate. I typically don't like to run that until I feel pretty confident that the projections I'll be using for that build are going to be the same or very similar to what I'm going to use for my final lineups. This is actually a reason or another reason why I actually don't do a lot of research builds for NBA is because sometimes those final projections that you're actually going to be using to enter into your contests are things that are finishing 10 minutes or 5 minutes before lock, depending on how quickly news is breaking or how close to lock news is breaking. Just another reason, maybe you only have time to run the build that you need to work with, and you don't have time to run a research build, and then you do your actual build in a sport like NBA. Golf, I was running research builds. I was running my like test builds, my final builds. I put all my lineups in before I went to bed, right? Like the projections were not going to change yesterday at that particular point. Same thing, NASCAR. I know we're talking a lot about that. After the qualifiers are done, we know the starting positions. We've run our sims. Projections aren't really going to change much from there. You can basically start running a test build. For football, our projections, our final sims run about an hour before kickoff. So after those are done, about 50 minutes, 45 minutes before kickoff, the final projections are pretty much in there. At that point, it's a good time to kind of start running things. Hockey will depend on the slate. I think in general, you mostly have the news for hockey within a reasonable amount of time before lock. I think normally 30 minutes before lock is fine. Sometimes you don't. I know it was last night. Last night with McKinnon out for the Avs lines were a little uncertain, and then they came out like only 15 minutes before lock. In that case, I had to kind of start over a lot of my work because the lines changed, right? It was all about like where Confer was going to skate. I think we had him on line 1. I know other sources had him on line 3. And then at 15 minutes before lock, he was skating on line 2, and the lines were a little bit different than everybody expected. So I think short answer is when you have projections that are basically what you are going to use for your final build, then I think is a good time to start running, test builds or research builds or whatever you want to do. But good question there. So, and then a question from Dallas here. He said, maxing both the mini max contest tonight and first is 1,000 and 1,500. With it being 7 games, would you make 300 unique since first is more than 10x of an entry fee? Also playing the jukebox and one. Interesting question. I didn't know. You must have gotten lucky and gotten in that first mini-max because I think I missed it. I was looking last night, and I think the mini-max was like 36,000 entries, and I wanted to play that, and I didn't enter it until this morning, and then I had to enter the one that was smaller. I think I'm just in the smaller one. 300 unique. So I think you can justify it. I think I might if I was in your shoes here. I mean, you're going to take on a little bit of variance between which contest potentially has that winner in it. But I definitely think there's 300 lineups that are profitable, that you could build 300 profitable lineups for these contests. You're invested you're invested $150 to play both of them, with a max payout of 1,500 in first and even 1,000. I think in this particular situation, I would be interested in playing 300 unique. I think I would. I'd feel comfortable with that. Or at least if you told me that's what you wanted to do, I wouldn't talk you out of that. I think personally, I might still shoot to maximize my ROI there and just play the same 150 in both. But I think this to me is about as perfect of an example of where I would consider or where I would think about playing a unique lineup in both of these, just because it's very easy. It's going to be very easy to make 300 profitable lineups on a 7-game NBA slate. I don't think you are 10xing your entry fee or approximately 10xing your entry fee. I think is a good enough payout to reward the upside. And I think while we're talking about this, and since I have some time, I think it's worth noting like why I think about it that way. It's not like we're not trying to. It's not like we're just trying to be greedy and maximize our return on investment. It's mostly a function of basically the kinds of lineups that you're building, right? So if you go in here and you build 150 lineups, right? So let's see here. We've got 150, right? So this is your mini-max settings, right? 9 sim variance, very high sim variance setting, a relatively high ownership fade, right? These sliders are basically set up with assuming that your goal is to win this contest, right? That you are shooting for a very high upside event. And it's saying you are going to take on extra risk, fading ownership, playing very high variance players because the payout when you do so successfully is very high. Now, if you start investing more and more, right? If you could put in as many lineups as possible that you wanted into the mini-max, right? Let's say you put 500 in. All of a sudden, you're investing so much financially, your maximum return, even if you have a very high outcome, is much lower, right? Because that payout that max payout at the top comes down. So that's kind of why I like to do this. But I think in this particular situation, wouldn't talk you out of 300 unique into both mini maxes. I was only able to get entered into one, unfortunately. I think it's not a bad idea. I also think, is other functions here too of, if you feel like you've got a good handle on this slate, if you feel like you've got a really good edge on this slate, maybe you're justified a little bit more in playing both of the same 150 into both. It also depends a little bit on your bankroll investment here. If your investment into these contests tonight is 1% of your roll, 0.5% of your roll, maybe you feel a little bit more comfortable playing aggressively and putting the same 150 into both and try to take both down. If this is 5% of your bankroll, if you are basically capped out here, maybe it makes more sense to smooth your variance out. Give yourself a better opportunity to realize some of your equity there with a high upside lineup. So. But really good question. And cool. Okay. Sweet. I'm actually next. I'm going to jump to another question. This actually, I think this got DM'd to me on Twitter, actually. And Dallas, I don't know if it was actually from a Dallas that DM'd this to me, so I'm not sure if you're the same guy. Let me know if you are. But I got a question about NHL research builds and correlation. So I'm going to go ahead. We'll talk about this a little bit here. And if you have questions, go ahead and pop them in the queue here. I think this is like really the last question that I haven't answered yet. I know there were a couple that came in yesterday. We can talk about some of those. I've already answered them in Slack, but this is the last question that I know I haven't answered yet. So the question here, I don't have it word for word. What it was basically saying, if I'm running research builds for hockey, should I have the correlation slider on? Or what should I do? I actually, this question has come up before for these higher correlation sports. Is it worth doing this? And my gut reaction, and I don't even want to say gut reaction. I think the answer that I've kind of arrived at after thinking about this for a long time, I don't think you should. I think there is a way, and we can talk about a way if you want to do a research build, particularly to research stacks, that you can do that. The problem is that the research build, when you run it like this 0-0-10 build, is that it's pure in a way, because what's happening is we're just taking single game simulations and just printing the perfect optimal. Once you start to turn up the ownership fade slider or the correlation slider for research purposes, you lose that purity of those exposures, because every player's getting adjusted based on their ownership or their correlation in that case. You could theoretically end up with lineups that are not optimal for any set of simulations, right? And then it's kind of messing. So I think the biggest value of doing this here with no correlation is that you get that pure range of exposures. When I'm playing hockey, right, which I have quite a bit over the past week, and I run this build, and we might not be able to do the whole build because I know the hockey builder builds a little bit slower. But when I run this, you can kind of determine what are the stacks that you want to be under based on what the skaters you want to be under are, right? Like I think last night I had a pretty big stand against the Avs, right? Because when I was building my research builds, I was seeing that like Rantanen and Landeskog and Kadri, even, who was on line 2, I was seeing that they were like over-owned relative to their chance of being in the optimal. I didn't need to go research the Colorado line 1 or 2 stacks to know that. You could kind of just see that from the skaters alone. So I'm going to let this build. We'll take a look. And I do the same thing for baseball here too, right? Like I don't necessarily need to put correlation into my research build, because I can see that if the Padres are in Coors Field and it looks like Tatis is going to be over-owned, and oh God, man, all of a sudden put myself on the spot with remembering these baseball lineups, and Grisham and who else? Maybe Hosmer and who else? I don't know. Trying to rapidly name Padres off the top of my head without having played baseball DFS for a few months is kind of tough, but you get the idea, right? If those guys are over-owned on their exposures, you can kind of tell what that means about the lines. So like, what is our biggest leverage stands at the moment for tonight, right? Pittsburgh line 1, right? You can kind of just see it here, right? It's the lines here are kind of spelled out for you. So when you're making adjustments, it kind of shows up there. And that's kind of the same way I do this. And what's nice is that we know that like we didn't put in any rules or anything to artificially inflate things. So we can just kind of tell that each of these individual skaters alone might, again, I don't want to say that anything is like a fact here, especially this early in the day, but they might be over-owned relative to their expectation. With that, if you want to research stacks, right? Because what you'll find here is when you come in here and then go look at stack types, like these aren't representative of the kinds of lineups you would actually want to build for hockey, right? Because they're single slate optimals, right? Single slate simulation optimals, which aren't going to have the stacks. If you want to research stacks and you want to instead see a kind of list of how often certain stacks are the winning stack, right? What I think it makes sense to do that is instead of changing the correlation slider, is instead to set, that's kind of hard to say, a stacking rule, right? So maybe what you go in here is say, I want to see at least 3 players from, however you want to do this, right? I think a good way to do it is to use the actual stacking rules you would use for your lineups, right? and then go in here and run a research build like this. And this is still going to say, using the projections from single game simulations 1,500 times, build me optimal lineups, but build them with 5 even strengths or 2 3-man even strength line stacks in every single lineup. Now, this is going to take a little while to build. When you put some stacks in, the hockey builder does take a little bit longer to run. But I think if you want to research stacks in your research build, just put the stacks in as a rule, but still run it at 0-0-10. And I think this is a little bit of a better idea. Okay, so it is the same Dallas. So, all right, perfect. Well, this worked out. This is convenient then. So this is what I would do. So let me know what you think about this. Also, congrats on NASCAR last week. I saw your tweet about winning the Minimax for trucks and then Xfinity. And then I thought you were going to complete the cycle. I saw you were up there. Obviously, the NASCAR sweat's a little inconsistent. You don't even know if you actually have a good lineup until the race is over. But I saw you sweating that Minimax in the Daytona too. And I thought you were going to have the Triple Crown there. So I was watching that. But cool. All right. Tom asked a good question. We'll let our NHL stack research build just kind of build in the background here, because I got a couple other questions to answer. So Tom says, are you guys ever going to have NBA tiers? Optimizer would be nice. Yeah, that's the plan. We do want to add tiers in the future. I think sometimes a little bit smaller contests, but for some of the bigger sports, there are some decent sized contests there. Tom says, what are the keys to having an NBA tiers winning lineup? So, I mean, I think there's a couple things. I think a lot of times the edge in tiers kind of matches what the edge is in the classic version of the sport, at least for me. So off the bat, I think one of the biggest edges, and I don't even know if you can do this, to be honest, but assuming that you can late swap in tiers, I think one of the biggest edges that you'd find in NBA tiers is late swapping, right? I imagine the field does not late swap optimally for tiers. If you can't, which I feel like maybe there's a chance that you can't, I think NBA tiers is probably a little bit sharper because average projections are pretty good. And, there's not a lot of correlation. It probably makes sense to just play the highest projected player in each tier. And that's when you kind of lose some of that edge. In other sports, higher correlation sports, baseball tiers, football tiers, things like that, I think from what I've seen in my limited exposure to tiers contests, the field does not really deal with correlation very well in those kinds of contests. Like, who cares if, in your, your wide receiver tier or whatever, that you've got Tyreek Hill projected for 1.5 points more than Devontae Adams, right? If you build the lineup where you're using Aaron Rodgers as your QB in that tier, it makes sense to just stack it with Adams, assuming you're playing GPPs, for the same reason it does in classic contests. And I don't think people stack right in tiers contests, at least in my experience. So I would say, for NBA, assuming that you can, and I'm not certain that you can, but assuming that you can, I would say late swap is probably still the biggest edge there. So, but anyway, it is our goal to add tiers. So, all right, we're almost done here. We have very close to our 1,500, and there it is. Let's jump back here real quick so we can kind of, for people that are just joining now and know what we're talking about. So now, what are we going to see here? Well, so I guess one of the important notes to make here is that if you create a research build where you want to study stacks, you've set a stacking rule, I would not then use this for player exposures, right? It's kind of one or the other. Either use a research build without a stacking rule and study players, or set a stacking rule and study stacks. But at this point, these player exposures aren't going to be very useful to you. But what is useful to you is stack exposures. And actually, I think one of the most interesting ways that I like to do this is to figure out about how much exposure I want. I don't know if I'm going to play hockey tonight. I don't think I am. I might. I haven't decided yet. I probably wouldn't want to be more than about 30%, maybe a little bit higher exposed to any one stack tonight, because you can see, the greatest percent chance of a team to have a high optimal outcome, or the optimal outcome, is Pittsburgh at 30%. And this, based on our previous research build, is the number one team or stacks that I'm most interested in fading anyway, right? If you fade Pittsburgh, or at least are under on Pittsburgh, you by default are going to have positive leverage on virtually every other team here. So that's one thing that I think can be kind of useful, is it can kind of be a tool to figure out how much exposure is appropriate to a particular stack on the slate. And that's a risk tolerance question too, right? Like you can be more aggressively invested into one particular team or stack if you want to, but that's kind of how I've been using this. So, but cool. Let's keep it going here. Craig, I'm sure you guys already have this on your to-do list, but in case you don't, I think this could be helpful. Being able to add a player to a group just by clicking on their name. This would make it much easier when adding multiple groups. Yeah, it is. I think that's kind of a tier 2 groups idea that we've had. I think like our original vision for like how groups might look in the future would be to be able to just add a player to a group from here. And that's probably what you're talking about. Like maybe even like right clicking them, where right click doesn't really make sense for a web app because it's going to bring up the options, but like an option or something that would be like a drop down and say add to group. And then you can just do it super easily right here. Or maybe even like a quick add or something like that. Like all that stuff is definitely in the works for us. So yeah. So Craig said yes, exactly. Yeah, that's the idea. So I think we'll get there. We'll get there for sure. So I did learn yesterday. I can't remember who told me, but you can like check add players to a group. Let's see. Let me test this out. Yeah, so you can hold shift and bulk add. So this blew my mind. I had no idea you could do this. Like, let's say for basketball tonight, just as an example. Actually, you know what? I think where it's like most useful is golf. Let me hop over to golf. Or at least the example I was thinking about was for golf, where you might want like a group. You might want to group up your like 6K golfers or something like that. So you could do a group like this and say, I think this is so cool. I literally didn't even know we could do this. Max, yeah, Craig's way ahead of me. Max one of all 6K golfers. So go here. Right? Go there. Boom. And then you're in business. Less than, well, for some reason, I always think that less than or equal to is easier. Makes more sense in my head. Boom. There you go. So not to say this is always the optimal strategy, right? I don't think it always is. I think there are situations for sure where like there are golf tournaments where I think it actually makes a lot of sense, or I think you can get kind of unique by playing some more 6K golfers, but I know this is a popular one and I think this is kind of cool. So, but all right. Okay, cool. So here's what I'm going to do. I don't see any other questions in the queue right now. If you guys have questions, fire away off the Office Hours channel in Slack or YouTube chat. Let me know. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back. There were 3 questions that I felt bad about. They came in yesterday before the start of the stream. I answered them in Slack, but since we were doing a NASCAR stream, I didn't answer them on video. So I'm going to answer them here. I'll pick up any other questions that come in as soon as I'm done with these 3, and then we'll see where we're at. Sound good? All right, let's do it. So the first one, I think I was a little bit confused about the way that it was originally kind of presented. But the question was mostly kind of about like thinking about NBA percentiles. So let's kind of just talk about this. This was from Jack, and basically the idea here was using the percentiles as a way of kind of thinking about how exposed you want to be to a player. So instead of taking the percentiles as fact, what Jack was saying he was doing is he was kind of looking at them as a tool of saying, do I think this player has actually a greater % chance of hitting that outcome than is indicated by the percentile, right? And I think that makes a lot of sense. I think especially for people that are maybe very passionate about the sport or very good at like that particular sport, that makes a lot of sense to me. Like maybe you're looking at this and you're looking, instead of looking at the average percentiles, you're looking at the 95th percentile and thinking, I think a guy like Steph Curry in a game against Portland has a greater than a 5% chance to score 68 fantasy points, right? I think that kind of makes sense, at least intuitively for me right now, right? Well, what should you do with that information, or should you bump up your exposure to that player? I think that's a sound approach, and I think that's a good way. I think that's one of the better ways of using the percentiles to kind of help you out, right? Using an average projection, averages are tough. I think some people have an intuitive sense of average projections, but I think when you have the range of outcomes of a player kind of distributed like this, it can help a little bit, especially for shooting for upside. Right? I mean, another way of kind of thinking about this is basically you can take Devin Booker all the way down to probably even like Trae Young, DeMar DeRozan, about right there, right? And basically kind of bucket those guys and say that for the purposes of upside, these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 players all essentially have about the same maximum upside level, right? And I've talked about this a little bit before as a way of saying, I guess you could actually kind of group Towns in there too a little bit and say that's kind of a bucket, right? And I've talked about this before from the standpoint of ownership, right? So if that's true, and we're just taking that at face value, it probably stands to reason that there's maybe a little bit of an ownership opportunity particularly on Towns and DeMar and maybe even Steph and Ja Morant, right? You can actually kind of see leverage opportunities here. Like, why is there a leverage opportunity at Towns, who is the second highest projected player on the slate? Well, because the first highest projected player on the slate is Jokic, who's massively well projected and actually even a better value play than Towns, right? Even though he has this kind of upside, right? Like there's a leverage opportunity. But I think the purposes of this question was actually more of, if you looking at this list of 6 players, right? Is there one or two, or like, does it actually make sense to you that all of these players have about equivalent upside, right? And if you're a well-studied NBA DFS player, right? If you're somebody that does kind of a lot of your own research, maybe you have a reason to believe that that's not the case, that there actually is kind of more of a spectrum of these 6 players. And I think how you would react to that, I think bumping up your exposure and making sure that you're over the field on one of these guys, I think is a great way to do it. I think you could also bump their projections, right? Maybe Steph stands out, right? I mean, this is a total narrative and not typically representative of the way I play. But if you watch the All-Star game, right, Steph went crazy. And he was actually in quite a bit of a slump before that. I think it's interesting. It's possible that the result of that is that instead you get this, which is not what we want, right? But maybe you get this or this, right? Maybe you have a better overall mean projected outcome for Steph because he's shooting a little hot. So I don't know. Interesting question. Good one to think about there. And let's jump to this other one. So I guess this is kind of a good next question to talk about here, or at least it kind of leads in pretty well. This one was from KB. What is it? KP. I know we have a KB in Slack. We have a KG. Now we got KP. He said, I have a question about NBA stats. What particular stats would you look at in regards to a tier 1 or tier 2 player to see who has the best matchups, like opponent averages against certain points, defensive rebounds allowed, etc. So a lot of this stuff, I mentioned this in Slack. I don't do a lot of research into like detailed advanced stats. A lot of that stuff, the stats that are predictive are things that we're already going to be incorporating into the model. So I think going in, if you went in and you were looking at what teams match up well against particular positions or anything like that, a lot of that is already kind of baked into the model already. And I think you can end up potentially double counting a little bit there if you're not careful. So to be completely transparent, I don't do a lot of that. I think you can be successful doing that. I think if you want to do that kind of research, say you're researching DVP stats or advanced stats or things like that, there's 2 things I would do. The first is make sure that you run it before you change anything, run a test build, right? If you run your test build and you've done all your research and you're like, holy crap, Jokic matches up perfectly against the Kings. They're not going to be able to stop him. He's the best play on the slate. If you run your test build, you're probably already going to see that. You don't need to go in then and adjust Jokic's projection, right? The second is, I would say, is to keep an eye on ownership, right? I was talking about this a little bit yesterday in the stream yesterday. If you find a stat or some particular research opportunity on, a guy like, maybe you're researching this and you're like, actually Towns matches up really well against the Grizzlies or Steph or Ja or one of these guys, these lower projected guys, lower owned guys at the top. project really well, right? They match up really well against the team they're playing, and you want to give them a bump. You stand to gain something there, right? Because they're already going to be low owned. So I think from just a game theory angle, it kind of makes more sense to, first of all, run your test build so you have a good understanding of the slate. But if you find a reason to be a little over on a player that otherwise is not projected well and not going to be owned very highly, I think that is going to be more beneficial to you than double counting all the best projected plays on the slate already, right? Or if you did, I don't know. I guess I think I've already made my point on that. So I'll leave that there. But again, full disclosure, I don't want to give the impression that this is like skeleton key. I don't do a lot of this because to me, all of this information is already well baked into the model. But I do think there can be an opportunity there if that's kind of in line with the way that you want to approach the game. So, and then Joe asked a really good question here on the golf side. And he said, is weather factored into the sim for PGA? If not, how do you handle weather in the PGA projection? So we don't factor in weather at the moment. I think there's a couple things about it. First of all, if the weather's bad, if the weather's just going to be bad all event, it's going to, or bad all day or something like that, it's going to affect everybody. I don't think there's a huge edge to be gained there. There is an edge to be gained there when it is inconsistent weather, right? If a storm is coming in, if wind is going to pick up in the afternoon waves, then there's a correlative element that shows up where it can be to your advantage to build lineups that have more golfers that have the morning wave, right? We don't, unfortunately, have tee times in the app at the moment, so you have to do a little bit of your own research here. But on a slate where there is weather, and I think on Showdown, right, since you're just playing for a single day anyway, I think you can take more swings at this. But if there is a event where there's going to be weather, right, if there's going to be, especially a wave split weather, I think it makes sense to take advantage of the new groups and to build a group for it. And to maybe pack, you'd have to, there's no tee times in the app, which I know is a little frustrating. It's something we want to add. You'd have to do a little of your own research, go get those tee times and put maybe the morning golfers all into a group. And from there, build the rule for however you want to tackle it, right? I know Max was mentioning that, when he's playing, if there's a big weather split, he'll say 6 players at every player from my lineup, all in the same tee time, right? But even if there's like a little bit of weather, a little bit of a difference, I think it can make some sense in a sport where the edge is already small and it plays kind of random. I think it makes sense to capitalize on whatever edge you can get. And in that case, you might as well build an aggressive rule or group and hope that the weather is just a total mess. So if you're interested, if you don't really know where to get that information, Kevin Roth does do golf content. So I think... yeah, so it's on the Roto Grinders site, but he does this for every event. So you can see, right? We actually had that today. I didn't really build in a weather edge on my approach, but I wish I did. Now looking at this, but peak wins this afternoon. So if you played the Showdown today, I think that maybe makes some sense. I even think, on a course that already plays as difficult as PGA National, I think maybe you could get a little bit more of an edge by tackling that weather component there. But anyway, good question. Tom, another golf question. In golf, what's the lowest you would go on a golfer? Is 4% too low? I don't think so. I have guys in my pool this week that are like less than a percentage point owned, especially in some of the larger field contests, right? I'm more interested. I don't really care too much about the low end of ownership, right? My biggest thing in golf is I'm very careful with the way that I'm navigating the chalk, right? I want to make sure that for the chalky golfers that I am having an intentional stand. Even if I'm on that guy and that as a golfer that I have exposure to, I want it to be intentional. I am over the field on Berger this week. And that is something that I kind of ended up on because in my research, I actually thought that at about 25%, 20% owned, which I think is what he's at, I thought that ownership was efficient or maybe even a little low potentially. I am way under. I almost completely faded Horschel, who I actually think is having a pretty good day today. But I am way under on Horschel. So I don't care really about the low owned golfers. A lot of them will end up in my pool one way or the other, but I'm very intentional about my chalky golfers. So Dallas says, building off the first question, is there a line when you can run too many unique lineups, say 2 to 150, 420 max? Couple examples on the top prize here. Dallas said, I'm guessing this would be based on risk tolerance and amount of bankroll used. This is what I struggle as most deciding number of lineups. Yeah, so for me, a couple things is I don't like, first of all, in the number of lineups, I don't like to take up more than 1% of the total lineups in the contest, right? My goal with any one lineup is to make that lineup into the top 1%. I don't want to play so many lineups that, assuming I played perfectly and have all of the top 1% lineups, that I am still more invested into that contest, that I have lineups that literally cannot be in the top 1% because I took up all of that equity. That will never happen, but that's kind of the way I think about it. From there, I typically like to make sure that my top payout, right, my maximum prize for one lineup is 10x of my total entry fees. So if I'm going to play I do this for contest selection too, right? Like I don't play quintuple ups. I will occasionally play 10x boosters and things like that. Like everything to me starts at the ability to 10x, right? And for a GBP, for example, I want to make sure that if I just win with a single lineup and every other lineup fails to meet the cash, that I can 10x my investment, because I want to get paid out in line with the amount of risk that I am taking in constructing these lineups, right? To be efficient in these contests, you have to fade some ownership. You have to play with high variance lineups. You are assuming an amount of risk to have this 1% outcome take place. I want to get paid out like that happens. So when you're talking about, these multiple contests, I think there's other things that come into play. I mean, the big one is like, how much variance are you willing to take on in what contest that lineup ends up in, right? Like, let's say you're playing the dime, the quarter, the $1 and the $4.20 maxes tonight for basketball, right? Are you okay winning the dime with a lineup that, based on pure luck, could have ended up in the $4? I wouldn't be. But at some point you are, right? I know the example earlier for these two mini maxes, right? I would probably be a little bit more comfortable leaving it up to pure luck whether my lineup ended up in the smaller or the bigger mini max, right? Because, the prize pools are going to be similar enough for me. So I think that's a factor. I think the other factor is that if you're playing lineups that are if you're playing contests that are very similar, right, that basically are like these two mini maxes are very close to identical, playing 300 unique lineups like amongst two of them in some ways is very similar to playing both, or playing 300 lineups in one, even though like technically you can win both is the main difference there. It bears resemblance to playing 300 lineups in just one. So I would still want to make sure that I could 10x my total investment if I won one of these. And you kind of can with the mini max example before. So I'm not going to be able to give you a one size fits all answer here. You mentioned this is dependent on risk tolerance and bankroll used as well. I think that's absolutely true. I think it makes sense. The smaller your investment of your bankroll, the riskier or the more risk tolerant you should play, the more invested in maximizing ROI you should be. The more bankroll you invested, I think it makes more sense to overall smooth out your variance and give yourself more opportunity to win back some of your equity. I think also this isn't so much even about what your percentage of bankroll you used is. I think this depends a lot on your size of your bankroll, right? If you are growing a bankroll, it makes more sense to try to win back something on a night-to-night basis, because then you can reinvest it immediately the next day, right? Like it maybe makes more sense to be willing to have a maximum 5x or 6x or 8x payout if you're playing with a smaller bankroll, because that payout, while it does not maximize your potential ROI that you could have had if we played that slate out 1,000 times, you now take that and invest it the next night, and you can play a little more, right? And eventually, hypothetically, you're going to reach a particular point where your bankroll is somewhat static, right? That for one reason or another, I think the easiest example is that you don't want to invest. You'll reach a certain cap in theory of, I don't want to play more than this volume on any given night, right? Whatever that is. For some people, that's $100. For some people, that's $25,000, right? At some point, everybody kind of reaches that point. And at that point, your bankroll will be kind of static. Wins will be pure profit. Once you reach that point, it makes a lot more sense to just maximize your profit, right? Rather than playing to try to collect money as quickly as possible. There's no reinvestment that's happening at that point. It makes sense to just shoot for the moon with your ROI. So there's a lot of factors here, and it depends. It depends a little on the slate and the sport. It depends a lot on what the actual contests look like, and I think it depends some on your personal risk tolerance and what your individual bankroll looks like. Our official contest selection bankroll management strategies would say to play a unique lineup into every single contest you're playing, right? And the idea there is basically for that, right? We want to smooth out variance for people. We want to have people start up with SaberSim and realize some of their equity sooner rather than later. One, so you can reinvest it, but two, so that you can see how powerful these tools are more quickly, right? Because, I mean, I've simulated this on stream before. You can play optimally for an entire season and still have a losing season. So the more you can smooth out that variance, the more you can kind of visualize and see how this is working more quickly. But it ultimately is going to depend on your personal play style, and there's not a one-size-fits-all answer for everyone here. So anyway, let's hit the next question here. First of all, John says smash that like button. John's always preaching the likes in here, so appreciate it, John. Tom said, I find the guys up front in NASCAR are lower owned than stack the back. They stack the back. I find GBP winners have a couple guys up front and some in the back. Yeah, it depends a lot on the race, right? The stack the back mentality is definitely pretty popular on like the super speedway races, like Daytona. Again, I'm learning. I am learning that I'm learning NASCAR as I go here, so I'm a little bit fresh. But as we get into other races throughout the season that are a little bit more easily dominated, it will make more sense to have some more exposure to some of those guys at the top. One thing to remember too is that just because a guy starts at the start of the race doesn't mean he's a bad player. Doesn't mean that he's a bad play in some situations, right? Kyle Larson started at first, right? Doesn't project very well, is very expensive, but has upside outcomes in his range of outcomes, and you'll get these outcomes in your lineup builds, right? Let's build some lineups and just look. We'll just jump back to Daytona here, right? You're going to get a lot of lineups that are stacked the back just because there's so much place differential opportunity for these guys, but you'll also have some exposure to some of these drivers that are starting at the front, and you're right, they are going to be lower owned. So if you want lower owned golfers, or I'm getting mixed up now. If you want lower owned drivers in your pool, or you want lineups that have some of these lower owned guys, or you want leverage there, you can add some exposure into those guys. And because each of these lineups are built from a single race optimal, you'll get lineups that make sense for them, right? So let's look, right? Let's say you're playing 150, right? 150 is always fun. And you want some of these guys at the top, right? Let's get some exposure to some of these guys at the top, right? Maybe we want to at least be, a little over the field on Larson, right? Let's see, right? Maybe you want some of the exposure to these guys, right? Well, you're still going to get lineups. You're going to get lineup constructions that make sense. So yeah, like you have a Keselowski lineup in there, right? But you're kind of stacking a lot of the back guys in there along with it. So on a race-to-race basis, our sims should pick up on this very well. Like, I think if you're a NASCAR expert, there's definitely an opportunity to add some value here. But yeah, we should have a pretty strong understanding of the simulations of what type of race we're dealing with. So, but Craig says, can you guys go over how you guys figure out ownership for golf? I kept hearing that Keith Mitchell is going to be fairly chalky, but SaberSim had his ownership at 3.3. He came in at 18.3 in the big $20 contest. I don't pay too much attention to ownership in golf except for the chalk players. Just curious how you guys had Mitchell so low where everyone else had him as chalk. Yeah, I mean, to be completely transparent, I think the golf ownership projections are something that can benefit significantly from reviewing them and making adjustments. Like if you're hearing that a guy is going to be pretty chalky, right? I think it's a good opportunity to make some adjustments. So our ownership model right? There's a couple things here. First of all, projecting ownership algorithmically in golf is very hard because projections don't vary that much, right? Like there's not a big spread. It is difficult to determine who the field is going to think are the optimal plays because to a computer, to a model, which is what we are doing to determine our ownership, it is not a human derived calculation. It is going to assume that things are pretty flat and that there's not a big spread in different plays, right? I heard a lot as well going into this that like Billy Horschel and Keith Mitchell and these guys were going to be chalk, right? I made some adjustments there, and I would recommend doing that. I think long term, the obvious goal would be to have a better ownership model, but I think at the moment I would listen to your gut. Golf DFS is a very weird game because human elements really aggressively can take over, right? Like there is a lot of steam in golf. Golfers will get chalky throughout the week, which doesn't even make a ton of sense, to be honest, right? A golfer doesn't become a better golfer or a better fit for the course as the week goes on, but there is a legitimate steam element to golf DFS. And the model that we have for ownership is ultimately the same as we do for other sports. We take our projections. In this case, we take just our projections, which is another limitation. But we take them and we build thousands of lineups at high variance settings and use those exposures as our ownership projections. So if a golfer is getting steamed, if he is going to get popular throughout the week, or is just getting talked up a lot, we're just simply not going to pick up on that. And I think that's a really good spot to add some value or make some adjustments there. I would say typically there's this handful of golfers that you just hear their names a lot throughout the week as you're leading up to an event. If you're struggling with that, like if you're having a hard time figuring out, kind of what those names are, I would listen to some other content out there that's a little bit more focused on giving plays, right? I think Rick Run Good and Pat Mayo are good kind of opportunities to just kind of listen to somebody break down the slate, looking at a different model and saying, these are the guys that kind of pop, right? That will kind of allow you to get started on like identifying these plays. But if you go in here and see, this, and you're like, man, I really think he's going to be chalkier than that, I hear his name everywhere, I would 100% bump him up, right? And that even with a very sharp golf ownership model, it needs that in it because it needs a human element to kind of get there and dial it in, because it's humans making DFS lineups at the end of the day, mostly. And that factor is just huge in golf DFS. So, Tom said, I find most winning lineups are with guys up front with the popular guys. They say no winning lineups in NASCAR can have two cars starting in the top 10. Yeah, those kinds of heuristics, I think, are where people go wrong and why simulations can be so powerful, right? Because they obviously can win. That can absolutely happen. But your exposures to particular lineup constructions or particular drivers should match the percent chance of that outcome happening, which is exactly what happens when you use simulations, right? Like if you get some exposure to some of these guys, like let's look at that lineup build we just did, right? And just look at the big pool of 1,500, right? This is essentially the exposures of drivers in the optimal for single race simulations, right? Larson's optimal 14% of the time, Bowman 9% of the time, Keselowski 8% of the time. Like, of course, these guys can have good races, right? They just have so much more to lose because they have so many places that they could hypothetically lose, but they absolutely have upside situations, right? They could win the race. That's an upside situation for everybody. And that average projection is going to be artificially deflated. Like, look at Bowman's range of outcomes. This is 0, right? So yeah, of course, his average projection is lower than somebody that is the exact same quality of driver that's starting in 30th, right? So but it takes simulations to make sure that you get the exposure to these different drivers in the right proportions of how likely they are to be optimal. So Craig says, cool, I did adjust the ownership on some golfers, but I was curious if the ownership adjusts late in the week with some help of a human element. Thanks for clarifying. Yeah, I think it could in the future. At the moment, it is purely algorithmically derived. That would be that would be a departure from how we kind of think about things and do things here. Like, I actually think one of the things that is a big strength of what we do with SaberSim is that we don't have that element of human intervention, right? I think there are opportunities where it could be powerful and helpful to do that, but there are also opportunities where you leak bias in. And I also think it is a black box elsewhere because you don't know where that is being leaked in, right? I think it is nice to know that at the end of the day, that even if there are inefficiencies in the golf ownership model, for example, that you know that it is purely the model making these calls and that you can make adjustments kind of with that in mind. Like, I think there's a value in that alone. So it's a little bit, I think there's a bit of a push and pull there where I think it is hard to really accurately project golf ownership without having some human element. But I think at the end of the day, we probably will continue to feel more comfortable making that something that we hand to the user as an opportunity to do themselves, not to make the job more difficult to build successful golf lineups, but to know kind of where that line stops, if that makes sense. That, like, this is the way that our projection model thinks that the field would play optimally. And really what this is saying, right? Like, I don't know. Why did I type 3.3? Why did I think that would work? Really what this is saying, right, is that this is saying Keith Mitchell's a terrible play, right? At least according to our projections. Because the model's saying a sharp field would roster him 3% in 3% of their lineups. And like, you and I both know that this is probably closer to what was actually going to happen. And I think he came in at like 15 or 18%, right? Like, that's really what this is saying, right? And that's one of the things that's actually nice about the way the ownership numbers are set up right now, is that they, in some way, because of the way that they're derived, they somewhat reflect efficient ownership, at least assuming that the inputs to the system are also efficient, meaning the projections. So, but Tom says, what is a good strategy to have a golf winning lineup? Tough question. So I'll direct you to a couple of resources here first. So first of all, we have a couple golf videos on our YouTube channel that are going to be able to go into far more detail than I can right here. So if you go to our channel, Learn the Secrets of Daily Fantasy Golf. There's two videos here. I think both of these will help a lot. One's an hour, one's just 20 minutes. I think they'll give you a lot more kind of background on overall golf strategy. I also, was it yesterday? I think it was. So on yesterday's office hours, this question came in earlier, or 2 days ago now. This question came in earlier on the stream. I had a lot more time to do kind of a deep dive into it. I actually spent about a half hour talking about kind of my golf strategy. So I would check that out as well. But Tom said, I find using your optimizer, the tool score will only go to about 415 when most winning scores are over 600. Well, that's because what you are seeing when you build lineups here is you're seeing what the lineup is going to do on average. All right, we're back. I haven't had that happen in a while. Good old-fashioned SaberSim office hours internet outage. Anyway, what I was saying is that, like, this is purely a projected score, right? This is saying, what are these guys likely to score on average, right? The win condition for this lineup is not 400, right? The win condition for this lineup is where Louis wins it, right? You get 3 6K guys that all make it across the cut and probably like top 20, right? Lowry's probably like second or third, right? That's like your win condition. And in that case, these guys aren't scoring their average, right? Where's Lowry's 68.93 fantasy points in his range of outcomes? It's right about here, right? That's not what we care about, right? We care about these outcomes. Well, when we're building your lineups, we're not using this average, right? What we're doing is we're using single tournament or a very small subset of tournament simulations and building the best possible lineup around that. So when you get this lineup, we're not saying this lineup's going to score 400 fantasy points on average, play it. We're saying this lineup in a small set of individual simulations relative to the ownership of this lineup has very high upside. That's kind of what's being said about the lineup. So this question has come in before for other sports as well, that, projected score is purely a way of visualizing how well the lineup is likely to do on average, right? But it is by no means the tool that you should use to determine upside. And that's why we don't, right? We don't use projected score to determine what are the highest upside lineups. We use SaberScore, which combines ownership and the overall upside in that set of sims to determine what the best lineups are, right? It is other tools that lean over heavily on average projection, right? That are optimizing for average projection. That is not what we are doing. So Tom says, can it actually score a winning lineup? Yes, it can. Absolutely. But that is only going to happen. It is difficult for a lineup to have a top 1% outcome, right? If you played 100 lineups into a contest, your average expectation would be that only one scores in the top 1% of your contest. Only one of 100, right? That's just the raw average probability, assuming that you're a perfectly average player and playing with a relatively diversified set of lineups, right? So yes, it can. These are rare events that are rewarded like they are rare events, right? The payouts in GPPs are heavy, right? But they are events that are rare. I mean, you can kind of look you can kind of even roughly figure out what the raw probability of one of these things are. If you took a lineup and kind of matched each golfer up to what that golfer kind of needs to do for that lineup to be successful, right? You would probably have your pay up guys would need to, Louis was in that lineup we were just looking at. So Louis needs to win immediately. That's a 0.048 chance of happening, right? Shane Lowry probably needs to top 5 for that lineup to be successful. So that's now 0.048 times 0.11, right? You have 3 6K golfers that probably need to make the cut, right? Those are probably maybe even top 20. Those are probably 10% outcomes. We're very quickly going to be talking about an outcome that is probably well below 1% chance of happening. And that's for an optimal, right? Maybe you don't need the optimal lineup. To win, your lineup maybe needs to do less. But this is what upside kind of looks like, right? It is taking events that have a very low raw probability of happening and figuring out how can we optimize for that and make it the most profitable as possible. But nobody is taking lineups. I think there's this comment in the DFS screenshot culture on Twitter, right? And the tout world, right? There's this idea that there are people out there that are winning, that are winning GPPs every single night. It is not the case. And you can just know that because of the raw mathematical probability of what those events of happening are, right? That doesn't even have to be something that somebody has to tell you or be transparent about the results. You can just know that how often these events happen by just purely the raw probability. So, and there is no better tool out there that is poised to build lineups with upside, because we are the only one that basically understands how meaningless average projections are and how how unhelpful they really are for building for upside, which is why we don't. So, but anyway, I think we'll leave it there. I don't see any other questions. This is a good stream today. We're right at about an hour. So we'll go ahead and leave it there for today. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in, asking questions, watching, listening along. Enjoy the return of NBA tonight. I am definitely looking forward to it. Enjoy the rest of the Honda Classic if you played a little bit of golf this week. And we'll be right back here again tomorrow for the last stream of the week, 2 p.m. Eastern. So see you guys later. Take care.